My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Chris Leslie joined the Labour Party when he was only 15 years old. He was elected to Parliament in 1997 at a tender age of 25 years old, overturning a Conservative majority of 12,000. He's been a... The audience has been seated here. Chris has been a minister in the Cabinet Office and in the Department of Constitutional Affairs before becoming Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. He's now the Member of Parliament for Nottingham East and, of course, has the responsibility of holding the government to account on matters of great importance to our community as he's shadowing the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mark Hoban, in this most crucial time of development for our market. So could I ask you to extend a very warm welcome to Chris Leslie.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry that the chairman of AIFA, Lord Gummer, has had to leave us already. For those of you who were fortunate enough to see his speech, he was regaled in a fantastic white tie and tails arrangement, and I'm definitely not able to compete with that. Maybe that's because of the difference in political complexion, but I'm here to tell you tonight that the Labour Party's prawn cocktail offensive is clearly working in a new post-New Labour way. You have, of course, been enjoying the crab rillette gazpacho starter, and I will now, from now on, call this the rillette offensive from this moment forward. I'm delighted to be invited to address AIFA this evening, and those of you who have the patience to listen to those of us who want to opinionate on all matters to do with financial services. This is an incredibly interesting, turbulent, dangerous time in the world economy, and so for your customers, shareholders, and in my case, my constituents, there are very many people who are anxious and who are worried about their investments, their own economic future. And so it reminds us, I think, of the importance of good financial advice and having an independent financial advisory community who are part not just of the economy, keeping the oil in the wheels going in our society, but also rooted in communities, out there talking to people, helping people make sure that they have good plans for their economic future. Now, we've already heard this evening about some of the regulatory changes that are coming, the RDR and other arrangements that people are anxious about. And I represent a very poor inner-city constituency in Nottingham, very deprived, and yet a constituency who also need good money advice and good financial advice as well. I am quite worried that in the current arrangements we have, people are going to perhaps have less opportunity to plan for their future and less of a sense of where to go. And so it's really, really crucial that in all of the regulatory changes that are coming through the financial regulation legislation and through the advent of the Money Advice Service, but also, I think, through the changes that are going to be affecting IFAs, we find a way to achieve a number of things. The first thing that I wanted to emphasize today was the importance of the savings culture. How can we talk about the savings culture when people are being squeezed as much as they are? Well, it is important that we find a way, even for those of my constituents who are less well off, to impress upon them the need to be motivated to put money aside to save for their long-term futures. Demographics are changing, you know all the statistics, but I'm very anxious that the culture has become very short-term and we haven't got the incentives, the combination of encouragements to pursue a savings culture that will make a big difference. So one of the things that I want to press the government on are what we can do in order to really boost that savings culture. I know the Americans have embarked on a rather scary advertising campaign, save now or work forever. I'm not quite sure that would have necessarily the beneficial effect, but I know that the government are thinking about nudge strategies, thinking about suggesting 5 a day as a kind of equivalence in the savings arena. I'm interested in seeing what we can do to encourage people to recognize that they have to find a way of putting even small sums of money aside. The second thing that I wanted to talk about, though, was in terms of access to financial advice. What more can we do to change the information, the awareness that people have about financial products right from the beginning of their lives? To what extent can we change the curriculum to encourage financial education that really teaches people about the basics of savings and borrowing? I think this is one of those issues whose time has come, and I'm certainly very keen, now that apparently we've got a e-petition on the Number 10 website with over 100,000 signatures talking about financial education as something that is really necessary. Can we start to change that agenda and move things forward? And I think it would be really important to do that. The third thing that I think that we have to start looking at are the lessons that have come from the financial crisis. Now, all sorts of responsibility lies in a number of quarters with governments, with regulators, with investors, with central banks and so forth. But I do think that one of the key lessons we have to learn are the corporate culture, the corporate governance changes that I think are perhaps of interest to those of you who are focused on the investment sector, the asset management sector in particular. I personally believe that the mismatch between very powerful corporate management and who are consolidated and can act in unison are very, very strong when compared with the fragmentation that happens in the ownership, in shareholding. And I want to see a greater dialogue, a dynamic change, so that the shareholders, the owners, the investors in UK PLC have a better way of leveraging a beneficial effect on the behavior of corporate policy. It's a very easy thing to say, but it's very, very difficult to achieve. And I know that there is actually quite a good cross-party consensus in the House of Commons on how we might start to make some of those changes. But it's really, really important that we don't just assume that all investors are passive, that they don't have views about where their money is invested. They want to see good changes and active investment policies. And so I'm really interested in finding areas of reform that we can look at there. The fourth area that I wanted to touch on tonight was really to do with the regulatory reform agenda. Stephen knows that I'm going to be stuck up in the probably Committee Room 10 in the House of Commons and the committee corridor for probably about 3 or 4 months. And any of you who are at a loose end, please do feel free to come and visit if you're that way inclined. Looking at the financial regulation bill, the creation of the Twin Peaks model as the FSA in the sort of post-FSA era. And while I think most of us recognize we need to support greater attention and focus on prudential policy in our financial regulation, the anxieties that I have are these. First of all, to what extent are we giving consumers a real voice on some of those big and grand Bank of England Financial Policy Committee arenas? Second, are we really thinking that in the UK our regulators are the be-all and end-all of all policy decision-making, when in fact actually the European supervisory structures are so strong and are so forward-footed that they are actually steering many of the front-line impacts that you are having to deal with on a daily basis? So are our domestic UK regulators almost now playing second fiddle to a lot of that European agenda? And to what extent can we address that mismatch in the legislation we've got before us? And the third area of the regulatory reform agenda that I think needs to be addressed is the accountability of those regulators. And this is where the retail distribution review is something I know that has been of concern to very many people. Quite frankly, it's not acceptable to assume that we have a small clique of exceptionally intelligent but independent individuals who have quasi-legislative decision-making over many of the policies that affect not just your lives as professionals, but as my constituents or businesses across the country. There has to be a safety valve, there has to be a means for people to voice their concerns if regulatory decisions are made that may have unintended or unforeseen consequences. And the Treasury Select Committee today have published a report talking about the accountability of the Bank of England with some very good suggestions. I want, though, to also start to think about how can Parliament have a role in properly scrutinising and overseeing the work that the regulators do. So those are some of the questions that I think are really central. But the overriding issue of the day has to be the state of our economy. You have to only look at your watch or look at Twitter to find out what's been happening in the Eurozone only a few minutes ago. And apparently, is Berlusconi going? Is he not? We're not sure. But things are moving apace. And this is a very, very dangerous time. But it's actually one of those weeks where you realize that all economics is essentially political. And politics really does have an impact on the investments that you will hold, the returns that you are able to get, and yet we have a vacuum in the leadership that is there around the globe. I'm tempted to make party political points, but I'll try and avoid doing that for the moment. Suffice to say, we have to find a way to rediscover growth and pro-growth policies, not just here in the UK, but across Europe and, of course, across the world as well. Because if we don't have that growth in place, then all of these debt crises, the banking crisis and the recapitalizations we need, the jobs crisis that my constituents need, all of those things will not be solved unless we get returns, unless we get prosperity, unless we can generate revenues. So that, to me, has to be the focus of any responsible politician, whether you're in the House of Commons, in Europe, or anywhere around the world. And if you ever meet a member of Parliament, if you ever happen to correspond or email or tweet to one of your MPs, please emphasize to them the importance of growth, because it's not always apparent to all of them. Anyway, that's my general sort of two-pennyworth for this evening. I wanted to pay tribute to AIFA, to Stephen in particular and his colleagues, and commend them on the impact that they are having in Parliament and with policymakers from all political persuasions. I can absolutely tell you that they are doing the job that they need to do, impressing upon those of us who are in those dusty committees for hours on end of the importance of some of the changes that have to be made. I think it's a tribute to AIFA that they have that reach and that dialogue. And they've even been able to secure sponsorship from BlackRock for a fantastic free meal, in my point of view. Maybe I'll have to register it. I don't know whether it tips into that balance. But thank you very much for what you're doing, and to BlackRock, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.